All cops are bastards. This is quite the saying to throw around, isn't it? To me, it has a similar meaning as eat the rich and kill all men. So why does it feel so different to so many? Let's look at the history behind this saying. It's important to start where policing began to truly understand how such an acronym has been coined. I will take you through the different things ACAB has meant throughout history, and we will finally land at what does ACAB mean today, and how do we, as Americans, have to change our policing? Some key words you'll hear are corporal punishment, which is physical punishment intended to cause harm, as well as the word bastard, or to bastardize, and implicit bias. Those last two I will explain once we get there. Let's start with the history of American policing. I'm going to start this out by saying I got most of this information from NPR's podcast Throughline, which essentially a lot of historians come together and explain stuff. So we're going to start with slave patrol, which is one of the earliest forms of policing in America. Essentially, this was a draft-like system made up of white men between 21 and 45. You had to serve as slave patrol for part of the year. In Virginia and South Carolina, the slave patrol would enforce the slave codes. Slave patrol could arrest any slave who was traveling without a pass, similar to a hall pass system. They were permitted to use any corporal punishment of their choice. They did not have to arrest them. They could kill them. Even if a slave had a pass, they could get away with anything. The slave patrol ended with the end of the Civil War in 1865. So what's next? The Black Codes. The 13th Amendment ended slavery unless as a form of punishment. The way this was gotten around was the Black Codes. They were a set of rules that essentially made anything that a black person did punishable. If you didn't like how they were walking down the street, punishable by law. In 1866, the KKK was born as a way to enforce these codes. The KKK was very violent, as many of us know, and the government sent troops to stop them and then created the 14th and 15th Amendments, which were intended to protect black people. But the Jim Crow laws came along. The first real policing we saw was in the North, and it was a way for marginalized communities to police each other. For example, the Germans would police the Irish, and other communities would police each other. If you were slightly higher on the social or economic ladder, you could police the communities below you, the immigrants below you. And everybody policed black people. It was everybody against black people. Policing was built on a racial hierarchy. The New York police were all about politics and policing racial groups. Whether we're talking about slave patrol or early policing in the North, police were established to make sure the poor had their freedoms taken away, so they only had time to work. Whether it's building cities, like the Irish people were doing for the German immigrants, or it's slaves who are farming for their owners in the South. This is what policing was built off of. There's so much more that I would love to talk about, but we do have to move on. This is a good background for American policing, though. Next, we're going to get more into the history of ACAB. To bastardize means to change something in a way that makes it fail to represent the values and qualities it's intended to represent, or to corrupt. This definition is from noti.net. You will hear other definitions of the word bastard. It's used as a swear word today. This definition can be found, the definition I use can be found pretty much on any dictionary. It's just usually not the first one because it's not the most popular. Not anymore, at least. When we looked at the history of policing, we have discovered that policing started out on very racist grounds. So let's look at the argument, but police today aren't racist? 2016 Pew Research shows that 92% of white police officers in the survey believed that racism is a thing of the past. On the other hand, 69% of black police officers acknowledge that there is a lack of equal rights. According to more research, officers are more likely to shoot a black person holding a phone than a white person holding a phone. And overall, it showed that officers were racially biased when pulling the trigger. And this is from a Corel study on police bias. Implicit bias can be at play. Implicit bias is bias that is learned throughout our lives. Implicit bias is very hard to unlearn, but it's completely possible. And this definition was from the Society for Personality and Social Psychology. I'm going to do an example so you understand implicit bias a little bit better. I want you to close your eyes and think of a babysitter and a construction worker. Okay, open them. So I'm assuming that you thought of a womanly figure for the babysitter and a male figure for the construction worker. Why? Implicit bias. The only way to fix this bias issue is not easy, unfortunately. To unlearn bias, you must be constantly aware of the bias, as well as constantly fighting it. Why do you think of a certain gender when a career is named? You have to educate yourself on a certain bias, as well as educating yourself about communities or things that you don't know much about, such as women in the workplace and in power. Or why do so many feel that black men are more violent than white men? A hint for that one is going to be policing, mass incarceration, and media portrayal. You have to challenge your beliefs. I personally have a bias notebook. An example of something I would write in it is when I wrote about how there are close to no ethnic Who's in Whoville. Like, I think in the newest Grinch, there were some Who's that had a brown or black tint to their skin. That being said, they weren't in any of the big scenes. They were just in passing in town. They weren't in the final dinner scene because that's not seen as normal. Less representation for marginalized communities equals more bias. A personal example for this one is I obviously have very curly hair, and all of my life I absolutely hated it. I thought I was ugly. I thought my hair was terrible. I thought it wasn't normal. And this was because all of my favorite characters in movies, TV shows, princesses, superheroes, everything, they all had straight hair, or like wavy hair, Hollywood hair. And I have this crazy curly hair, and I hated it. It is because I did not see people like me represented in media. And this is how we treat marginalized communities. Less representation for marginalized communities equals more bias. Today, ACAB is a way to protest the harsh treatment of marginalized groups by cops. Cops need half as much training as a hairstylist, even though they are trained with weapons in dealing with many types of distressed people. ACAB is a way to radically express the lack of education and the intense bias most police officers hold. If police officers went through bias training and psychology courses, many would understand bias on a deeper level and feel the need to work on their personal biases. Police officers who get further education would also learn about how to react to different situations that do not need to involve violence. For example, according to CBS News, Albert Lee Hughes was in a Wendy's and people called the police on him for trespassing. He was in the dining area with a beer. Hughes allegedly tried to attack an officer with a chair when they arrived. The officer's taser did not work, so they shot, and Hughes was killed. He was killed over what seems to be a drunken mistake. If police officers were trained extensively in communication involving how to effectively talk somebody down, a man may have kept his life. I would like to add, as a CNA, which is a certified nursing assistant, and an educator who works with young kids, talking kids and senior citizens down, especially those with mental impairments, takes training and practice. It is not easy, and it has taken me years to get decent at it. But it's very possible in many cases, so why is this not the standard for officers? Is invalidating an entire opinion and view on the world because of a misunderstood phrase worth it? People who disagree with ACAB usually do not understand and/or refuse to open their minds to learn. Police do not have to be so quick to pull the trigger. If teachers and healthcare workers have to deal with violent students or patients using Harmon anyway, I'm sure there is a way to help lessen the number of people killed by cops. I have been hit by residents working as a certified nursing assistant, and if you use just the slightest bit too much pressure when you're touching a resident's skin, they will bruise, and if you accidentally bruise a resident, you can be fired for misconduct or for resident abuse. So when a resident's trying to hit me, even if they can't control it, because most of the time they can't, or if they're verbally abusing me, I know how to deal with it. I know how to talk residents who seem like they're out of their mind in the moment down to where they're calm. It's of course not always the easiest thing, but it's usually possible. I have kept kids from running away from me because all it takes is the snap of a finger for a kid to get super overwhelmed and try and do something crazy and freak out. And I've gotten kids to not run away from me and still love working with me and being super tolerable with me. If you yell or try and fight back, it's only going to scare the person who's already overwhelmed or feeling some sort of way more, and they're going to react more intensely. How do you help? The bones of American policing is racism. This system that protects so many kills so many as well. ACAB is used to fight the lives lost due to a police officer acting too fast with a gun, as well as a way to fight unnecessary harm caused by police. Police need to be better trained in talking down and dealing with those in distress. The officer's life is not the only one on the line. Police are shown to be more trigger happy when somebody of color is involved, and most white police officers don't even believe racism is still an issue. This is due to implicit bias, which can change with a lot of work. Going forward, we need to keep ourselves and others accountable. Keep a bias notebook and track your own bias or ways that marginalized communities are not represented in everyday things. Once you notice one thing, you start to notice a lot. Fewer representation means more bias towards that community. You need to protest, fight, and educate. The only way to change the world is to be active. Educate yourself and your peers. Go to local police reform protests, sign petitions, and be involved. This is a long fight, but winning it will literally save lives. Thank you for listening.